Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH. Today, we're gonna take a look at these things, which are 6 2.5 gig Ethernet Intel i225 based firewall and router appliances. These things are being used for things like OpenWRT, pfSense, OPNsense, all those kind of things. And you can also run virtualization on them. We actually run Proxmox and then virtualize all of the firewalls in them. These are super cool units. Now, you may have seen that on YouTube, we've done the N5105 units. We've also done the N6005 units, and those are really the 4-port versions. But now there are 6-port versions, and there are other processor options. But you might have noticed that we don't just have this one unit, we actually have 3 different units because we were looking at 2 processor options. And one of the processor options, we had a system that frankly was not great. But the other one actually works pretty darn well, and I really like it. So I really want to talk about that mostly in this video. So ever since starting reviewing these units, what we basically found is that these things get upgraded all the time. I mean, these things are upgraded every couple months, and sometimes, especially during the summer when we have some of our team out, it takes a long time to actually go and review the units. So that's been a challenge just kind of keeping up. And so, for example, instead of doing a video on the N095 unit, we said, no, that's just gonna be a main site article. And then this one, we are gonna be combining 3 different units into one. But this one that I'm holding in my hand might be the most impactful one because this uses the Intel Core i7 1165G7. That's a 4-core, 8-thread processor, and it is pretty darn fast for a network device, and so that's why I thought it would be really interesting to go and look at. But it's also a higher power processor, and that meant that we had some issues as we started testing these. And so what you're looking at is a picture of 3 different units, and these are the ones that we're gonna talk about today. The one that's on top is actually one of the Intel Core i7 1165G7 units. That's the one that I'm not overly excited about. The one below it is the Intel N6005 unit. And then the one directly below that is probably the better Intel Core i7 1165G7 unit. Now, the really cool thing here is that all of these have 6 2.5 gig Ethernet ports, but they also offer things from a lower power Atom to a higher power, really the Intel Core i7 solution. So they span the gamut, and they also have pretty different costs. And I think that that cost thing is gonna end up being one of the biggest differentiators. And I'm also gonna give you some advice that we learned along the way, because I think that's also really important. And before we get too far in this, one of the new features that we have is you can now join the STH YouTube channel. And so you can find that link down below where it says join. And that just is a little subscription that helps us do things like buy all of these units so we can actually go test them for you. You know, if you can help us out, that'd be awesome. But now let's get to the hardware overview. So the first one I want to look at is this one right here. Now this is the Atom, and this is really the N6005 unit. Now we have tested 2 previous units, but those only had 4 2.5 gig Ethernet ports. So this is something that is definitely a little bit different because we have 6 and also means that we have a different motherboard and all that kind of stuff. The first thing I want to talk about though is just the size of the chassis. Now this is one of the larger 4-port units, and so you're gonna see that this one, they look like they're relatively the same size, but if I put them next to each other, the 6-port model is actually just a little bit bigger. And the one that we have is a 4-port model. That's also probably the largest 4-port model that we saw. We didn't see any, we saw definitely some smaller chassis, and that's really important. The new unit weighs something around 8% more than the other N6005 units that we've tested. Now the N6005 in the other chassis, frankly, has not been my favorite because that one has been, you know, some folks have seen it overheat. We haven't actually had any problems, but I also kind of think that just for the price, I don't think it's necessarily the right answer. But in this unit, we actually have not really had any issues with temperatures, but I think part of that is just the fact that this is a more substantial, heavier chassis. But that chassis size is really important just because this is a fanless unit, and that is a key feature of these that we found. Now, something I want to talk about real quick is let's talk about the front of the system because this has something different than we've seen previously. We have 2 USB 3 ports, 2 USB 2 ports. A lot of people like that USB 2 because, you know, for keyboard, mice and stuff and setup, that actually is kind of nice. There's also an HDMI port, so you can go hook this up to a TV or something if you want to go do setup that way. And then the cool thing that this has is this actually has a COM port, and a lot of people have wanted a COM port because that allows you to go do, you know, some people are just kind of used to it with a lot of network devices, so having a COM port is actually kind of a cool feature on this one. Moving to the back of the unit, we have 6 2.5 gig Ethernet ports. Now these are all Intel i225, and these are B3 stepping ports. So these are SLNMH NICs. And what that allows you to do is basically get 6 2.5 gig Ethernet links out of the system. There's also a 12 volt power input. And if you have a PoE splitter, and most likely like a PoE, I would say PoE++ switch, you can actually power this and run these passive. We actually have a review of the splitter that we use for some of these units online. So you actually can, this doesn't accept PoE in, but if you do use a splitter, you can actually get PoE, PoE power these things. Now at the bottom of the unit, we have the newer design bottom where you have a lot more cutouts. You actually do have a place for like a 40mm fan. Now we did not use the 40mm fan, but you could. There's also this cutout down here. So if you do want to do something like have a SSD that sits external, like if you have a 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drive that you want to sit external from this chassis for some reason, you can actually go route the SATA cables through this little cutout. We didn't actually pull it out, but there's actually a little cutout there. Now, if you look inside this unit, you're definitely going to say, hey, this is something that's very similar, but also a little bit different from what we've seen previously. The basic layout of the system is up top. You have 2 SODIMM slots. You use DDR4 memory for this. Then you also have a M.2 slot. That's really for your storage. And then there's also an MPCIe slot, which you can get things like, and there's a SIM slot. So if you do want to get something like a 4G LTE modem, allegedly you can go and order those from the vendor. We haven't ever tried them. Some folks have reported some mixed results. So I don't necessarily know how I feel, but there is a SIM card slot and an MPCIe slot. So if you want to go do that, you can. I will just note that if you just wanted something like Wi-Fi, this is not typically what you would see these days. Usually there's a small M.2 form factor that most of the NICs come in these days. So I don't necessarily know how I feel about like how useful that is, but folks always want us to mention it, so we are. You'll see that we have the CW-N11 motherboard, and then this one has the little sticker that says that this is a N6005 unit. Up top in the corner, we have a 4-pin power connector. Now, we weren't able to get the PWM function actually to work and like spin up and down fans on this, but I don't actually use fans usually with these units, so it really isn't an issue to me, but we do have some folks on the forums that have been using them, and I don't necessarily know that everybody's had a lot of success on the different motherboards with that feature. So if you want to run a fan at like full speed, what I would say is get a low speed like Noctua fan or something like that. Use their low noise adapters or something to actually cut the speed, and that'll get you a little bit of airflow on this section, especially if you're going to use a hotter NVMe SSD or a lot of memory. You also notice that on the old top-10 units, you would see that the NICs on here would actually be on this side of the chassis, but on this 6-port motherboard, they're actually on the other side of the chassis. Those don't really use a ton of power, but they do actually add a little bit more heat to the side. So that is removing 6 heat sources from this side and putting them on the other side, which seems to work a little bit better. Along the bottom, we have the header for the SATA power and data connector. So if you need to go and add a 2.5-inch SSD, well, you totally can go do that. Now we're gonna talk about the performance, but again, this is a 4-core Intel N6005 processor in here. It is more of an Atom class processor, so it would be something that would be more akin to like maybe a C3000 series if you're looking for something that's relatively equivalent. It is a newer, I guess, 10 nanometer generation, so it is a newer processor, but on the other hand, this is not the full cores. If you want the full cores, that's when you get to the Core i7. Okay, we have the 2 Core i7 models, and if you can look from the pictures, you're gonna see that the front and rear of these units is basically exactly the same. These are the exact same motherboard inside. The big difference of these units, whoa, the key difference of these units is that this chassis is about 13% heavier than this one. It's also a little bit larger that you can see from the pictures. And the reason that that is important is because by having more, I think, area or something like this thing actually keeps the processor significantly cooler than we saw with this one. We're gonna go through, the motherboard and all that kind of stuff, but in the end, we're actually gonna say that you should get this style of chassis because I think this is what we're gonna call the good one. But since for recording the video, I have these things configured a little differently, one bare bones and then one with actual stuff in it. We're gonna kind of go run through these like they're similar. Okay, so when we look at the front of the systems, both systems have the exact same features when we look at the ports and stuff. So same motherboard, all that. So we're just gonna use this as our model. But what you're gonna see here is that we have a total of 4 USB 3 ports. There's also an HDMI port and then a COM port in the middle. That COM port, again, is a serial console port because a lot of people like having their firewalls and routers with serial consoles. And so that actually gives you that feature. That was something that we did not see in older generations of these inexpensive boxes. On the back of the unit, we see a DC 12-volt input, and then we also have our 6 2.5 gig Ethernet ports. Now these, again, are the Intel i225 versions. We are seeing a little bit bit of the market, especially in the 4-port units, start to transition to the I226. But these are B3 stepping and they are SL-NMH NICs. So, that's actually pretty good. At the end of the day, getting 6 2.5 gig Ethernet ports is actually pretty useful, especially if 4 is not, enough for you. A lot of folks, need maybe 1 or 2 extra ports, and that's really what these 6-port units are there for. Now, inside the unit, we actually get stuff that's really kind of interesting, especially because we've reviewed a bunch of these inexpensive units. So let me just kind of show you a couple of them. So I just talked about the NIC ports, but on this side, we actually have 2 of the Intel i225 SL-NMH chips. They're on this side, and then there are 4, I guess, on the other side. It's just kind of weird because in all the other units that we've looked at, they're either on one side or the other. Now, up top, you get 2 SO-DIMM slots. Now, these are DDR4 up to, I think, 3200 you can put in here. You can use lower speeds, and sometimes that offers a little bit better power and a little lower power, and a little lower heat generation, so folks do that often. But at the same time, these are the Core i7 units, so you get a decent amount of performance, and having memory bandwidth is always good. On the motherboard, we do get a SIM card slot, but we don't get an MPCIe slot, so I don't exactly know. Maybe you're supposed to get like an M.2 like modem or something like that. But the M.2 mounting options are not great in this, and then we're gonna get to that next. Okay, so here's the M.2 slot, and you're gonna notice that there's this little piece of metal, and the little piece of metal has the peg that you actually go and put your M.2 SSD on. So I'm gonna swap over to the configured unit, but you're gonna see that this little M.2 SSD is actually, it's not level with it's not in the same plane as the motherboard. It's actually kind of on a little angle, and that's just kind of like a really weird way to have an SSD. The other thing on all of these units, we see a lot of people that are trying to go put like really high power, high performance NVMe SSDs. I personally would not do that. In this unit, we tend to use lower power SSDs because this is a little bit thermal constrained because it is a fanless chassis. So, if you're going to try put like a 980, a Samsung 980 Pro or something like that in there, I think that's probably the wrong type of SSD for it. These Western Digital Blue, I think they're the SN570s. They tend to actually work pretty well. They're not overly fast, but they are definitely faster than SATA, and they tend to be pretty cool drives. The other one that I want to just point out though, and this is a question that we've gotten in a lot of comments on some of the other articles that we've done on the main site and also on YouTube, is what about the memory? Can you mix and match memory? So for this, I actually took an HP and a Lenovo just DIMM, and one is a 4 gig DIMM, one's an 8 gig DIMM, and you can see in the BIOS that we actually did get a total of 12 gigabytes of memory. So last thing I want to talk about is just at this bottom down here, what we actually have is the fan power, and then we also have the SATA data and power connectors. So a couple of weird things about this that I think are just a little different. One, a lot of the 4-port units that we've seen, they have a 4-pin fan header. This is a 3-pin fan header, so that's a little bit different, but it's also just something I wasn't expecting. I thought all these would just be 4, especially if you got the newer models, but that's not necessarily the case. The other thing is that the power and data connectors are not the exact same as you would have on the other 4-port unit. So why that matters, it's not like a huge deal, but why it matters is just if you buy a bunch of these and you think, oh, I can interchange those little cables, you actually can't because they're different headers for the power connectors. They all come with the right cables, but they don't necessarily come with the same cables if you get the Atom versus the Core i7 versions. Now again, the processor in this is the Intel Core i7 1165G7, and that is actually a pretty darn fast, it's an 11th gen core processor. It's really meant for more of like a mobile type of segment. And so we have looked at a number of systems that, are embedded type systems that have this kind of 11th gen core. And, frankly, they give you darn good performance. This is, something that's soldered onto the motherboard. So it's not like a socketed thing that you can go upgrade. So you do have to kind of pick at the time that you order these things. But I do think that, this is a completely different class of performance than you get with the Atom based units like that N6005 unit we looked at earlier. Now we've already looked at the N6005 performance, so I'm not gonna go over that again. We talked a lot about that in comparison to some of the other Atom models in the previous video, so go check that out if you want to. The key thing I want to focus on in this video is really the Core i7 1165G7 performance. So just kind of running through a couple benchmarks, what we see is that you're basically talking about like 2x or a little more than 2x the performance for the Core i7 version versus the Atom versions. And what that practically means for folks, if you're gonna go build something like a pfSense or an OPNsense appliance is that you're going to be able to have things like WireGuard VPNs that are going to be over 1 gigabit per second, where that's going to be probably like the max that you're going to see on the Atom versions of it. You're also going to see that just performance-wise, you have plenty of performance. So we were able to go take all three. We set these 6 ports up as like pairs, right? So we had 3 pairs of ports, and we're able to go push 2.5 gig Ethernet speeds with iPerf3 across all of those, and we're even able to do a little bit more mix in terms of just kind of a more realistic mix of traffic. iPerf3 is a very simple traffic pattern, and it's not necessarily representative of what you get. But I do think that if you look at the equivalent processors and like what you can do, I think if this had 10 gig ports, if you just had a basic firewall, I bet you that this thing would be able to go and do, like pretty much saturate a 10 gig port in most scenarios. So the performance on this thing is absolutely phenomenal. It's just, the realistic use cases of it, you're probably gonna have maybe 1 or 2.5 gig flows going through the system max, and this processor can definitely handle that. Something that I do wanna talk about, but we didn't really test, but it is important to note, is that the Core i7-1165G7 has an Intel Xe graphics. Now, what that means is that this thing actually has things like quick sync video. So if you did want to go create something like a server that could do Plex, plus also do other stuff, you do actually have the iGPU in this system. So, it's actually not a bad GPU, frankly. So, that's something that we didn't actually test, because we are testing these more as, like a pfSense, OPNsense appliance, because that's really what these things tend to be focused on. But on the other hand, we were able to not just run those things bare metal, but we were able to go run them in a virtualized solution, which means that you can start thinking about doing other things. And I think that some folks will think like, hey, can I run a Plex server and then also run a, pfSense appliance or something like that? You totally can go do that. Okay, let's talk about power consumption because there are some definitely interesting things here. Okay, so first thing is just that our N6005 unit did use a different power adapter than we saw previously. And the power adapters that we get in a lot of these units are like these, which say replacement AC adapter. They're 12 volt adapters. They're 5 amps. And so we actually got a different adapter on this one, and we saw a little bit better power consumption than we saw previously. I think we got something like 10 to 11 watts instead of 10 to 12 watts at idle. And then at the maximum power consumption, I think we were seeing about 27 or so watts instead of 30. So I just thought that that was kind of interesting that even with the 6 NICs, we actually saw a little bit lower power consumption with this one. But also I know a lot of folks are replacing the power adapters that come with these because these are not very good. And they're replacing them with things like Meanwell power adapters. And that does cost more money, but on the other hand, it does tend to save folks a couple of watts. So it's just something to keep in mind. Now, getting to the Core i7 units, the one that I call the bad unit or the not good unit, that one came with something that's a little different. So the good one that has that bigger chassis that's about 13% bigger, that one came with this, which is our kind of standard 5 amp 12 volt power adapter. Now, both of them say 12 volt DC input, but we also got a 19 volt power adapter with the one that's I call the not good one. Now, in terms of the power consumption of the Core i7 units, we saw that we were getting about 13.6 to about 13.8 watts or so at idle. These things actually jump around quite a bit, but that would be what I would call like my safe, like if I were to budget, that's what I would use for idle. Then at the maximum that we saw running kind of easy workloads, that would be kind of like if you're running like a firewall or something like that, I think you're probably talking somewhere in the, I don't know, like maybe 28 to 30-ish watt range was pretty common to see. Now, something that we are gonna do, let me know if you guys think this is valuable, but starting with the one that I call the good unit, just kind of where that hit in the process of these things all going through our production process, we actually did get a new FLIR camera, and so we do have a FLIR image of that. You can see that we're seeing a little over 40 degrees Celsius in the overall chassis temps, which is not too bad. It does go up a little bit over time, but it actually wasn't too bad. I wouldn't necessarily touch this thing. I think it's too hot, and I would keep it away from small children and anything like that. But I just thought that maybe folks are gonna think that's interesting, and if you do think it is, let me know in the comments. And the other thing I just wanted to just talk about real quick is we're gonna run through a couple BIOS screenshots. There are things in the BIOS, like you can actually go adjust the different like TDPs, and there's a lot of different levers that you can use to actually lower the power consumption of this unit. We are testing this as stock because I think most people won't go do that. Also, we managed to install pfSense, OPNsense, and also Proxmox, and then virtualize the pfSense and OPNsense as well, like we were able to do with other units. This is still a Core i7, so it's super compatible with software, and as long as the Intel i225 NIC is supported, most likely you're going to be in good shape. Okay, so now it's time for my favorite part, which is always the key lessons learned. And I think that the first key lesson learned was we got the Intel N6005 unit for the Atom unit. And I think that the N6005 is good. It gives you a little bit more performance, but frankly, getting the non-N6005 and getting the N5105 unit is less expensive. At the time we purchased this, we paid $299 for the N6005 version. The current pricing on it is, you can find these things from various vendors like and stuff for about $287 or so at the time that we're recording this video. Sometimes there's little coupons on AliExpress and stuff like that, and stock definitely changes all the time, so it's a little bit of the Wild West out there, but you know, that's definitely about the right price. Personally though, I don't think you get enough performance, and also the power consumption tends to be higher from what we've seen on the 4-port models, that I personally would not get this one again. What I would get instead, if I were telling you to buy something, would be the N5105 version, because that tends to lose a little bit of performance, but you also have less power consumption, and the cost is actually way less. So instead of like a $287 unit, I think the N5105 units, those are something like $220. And you know, the difference between 220 and 287 is actually pretty substantial, especially if you're also going to get power savings. In places like Europe, you know, we have users that are telling us that each watt of power is something like, you know, $3, $4, $5 a year, maybe more. And so when you have a initial savings, plus you get a savings of, you know, maybe 2, 3, 4 watts per year, that starts to add up pretty darn quickly. It also means that it's easier for the chassis to cool it. However, on this version versus the N6005 that we saw in the 4-port unit, I think that this had a much easier time because it's a bigger, you know, it's that 8% bigger and heavier chassis. And so, you know, just personally, I think that if I did get an N6005, I would probably get the 6-port model with the bigger chassis rather than the 4-port model with the smaller chassis, just to get the more mass. Now, let's talk a little bit about these, the 2 Core i7 units and what we learned there. So frankly, this one I think is pretty darn good. Now, this has a chassis that's over 13% heavier, including the motherboard, right? So the actual chassis on a percentage basis is actually a little bit more than that. But the end of the day is this thing cools the processor way better than this one. This one we would see temps often get, you know, from about 55 to maybe 60, 65 degrees Celsius. Whereas this one, you know, a lot of times when you're just running this as a firewall, it's just kind of doing its thing. A lot of times, you know, this thing's running at maybe, I don't know, 40 degrees Celsius, 42, 43 degrees Celsius for the CPU, even when you're stressing it a bit. So this one tends to be, I think, a lot better. It is a little bit larger, but the way I can tell the difference between them on the online pictures is that you'll see that this just kind of has like fins on that side versus this one has this like kind of like through hole. And so that's what I would look for, is that through hole, because I think that this chassis is just a better one. And just because of timing, we did spend $539 on the one that I called the not good one, and we spent $524 on the good one, but that's because we purchased them at different times. But I think that the pricing here, again, is probably the most important bit, right? Because although the one that we had, which is the N6005 unit, which I probably would say get the N5105 for only $220, that still gives you 6 ports. It gives you a decent amount, I mean, pretty darn good amount of performance. But then when we go up to the Core i7, I mean, you get a ton more performance. I mean, like, you're talking more than 2x the performance in the, you know, mainstream Core i7 versus the Atom version. So, I mean, you just get so much more performance. You are using a little bit more power. Sure, it does cost considerably more because it's, you know, compared to the N5105 one, it's more than 2x. But if you are looking for something that's a higher power unit, I think it's actually a pretty good option. So if we bring up a picture of all 3 of these units, the top one, that is the Core i7 one that I say is not good. That's the first one we got, and that I just think the chassis is not good enough to cool it, or at least cool it very, very well. And so I would say that that one would be one that I would say don't get. I would say that the one below it, which is the N6005 one, that is one that I would get, but I would probably get the N5105 version of that. And then the last one, which is the bottom one, is that's kind of like the performance option, but make sure you get that chassis because that chassis is much better. So hey guys, I hope you like this video. I mean, we went through 3 units. Normally we do like 1 or 2, so doing 3 was definitely different, but figured why not just go put a bunch of these 6-port units together, just to kind of give you an idea of all the different 6-port options that we're really seeing. Now we definitely have more really cool stuff coming, and for example, this is the MikroTik, I think this is the RB5009U, this is the new PoE version, so get ready for a whole bunch of MikroTik reviews because we have a lot of that stuff that just arrived finally. And if you did like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.